Hello and welcome to Are You Ready to Glaze? No, really, seriously. Are you really ready to have everything that you need to have done before you actually apply glazing? This can cause lots of problems if you are not actually ready. So get ready. First, is your pot bisque fired? You need to make sure that your pot has gone through that first firing. It needs to be bisque fired, which means it's fired to cone 05. Remember, that's the lower firing of the two firings that we do. It makes the clay more durable. You're able to handle it more safely. If you try and glaze something, especially if you've got a handle or if you make a mistake, you're more likely to break your pots if you are trying to glaze something that has not been bisque fired. It also makes it so it's no longer water soluble. It won't dissolve in the water anymore, which means if you need to scrub it off, if you make a mistake or the glaze does weird things or whatever, you are able to wash off that glaze. If you're not certain how to tell, if you just tap the back of or use the back of your fingernail to tap the top of your pot, if it has a little bit of a ting, it is fired. If it makes just a soft, dull thud, it is not bisque fired. Just as a note, if you put it on the cart to be bisque fired, I don't put it back on the cart to be bisque fired unless we just run out of all other spaces. If I've not taken it off the cart, it is not yet bisque fired. If it's on the counter, it likely is. I do not take things off your shelf to bisque fire. That is your responsibility. But the pots must be bisque fired before you apply glaze. If you make a mistake and you apply glaze to a pot that is not bisque fired, as soon as you realize, you need to let me know, put it back on the bisque fire cart, even if it's got glaze on it. I will bisque fire it. It'll be ugly, but I'll refire it. You'll be able to do anything else you still need to do on the glazing, and then I'll glaze fire it and it'll be okay. So the reasons that it needs to be bisque fired: one, it's safer to handle, again, because it's more durable. It's no longer water soluble, which means you can rinse it without breaking. And you do need to rinse your pots before glaze firing, and I'll explain that in a little bit. I think it's the next slide even. The firing schedule is different for glaze firing than it is for bisque firing. I fire very slowly for the bisque firing. It makes it less likely to explode. If you go too quickly in a bisque fire, if there's any residual moisture, it heats up, it expands, and boom. Actually, it's more of a poof, but your pot will basically disintegrate anywhere there's moisture. If there's an air pocket and you fire quickly, it can also pop there. So we want to make sure that it is completely dry, so I fire very slowly when I do the bisque firing. For the glaze firing, I go so much quicker. Instead of overnight, it may only be 3 hours on low. So I go much quicker. So if they explode, it's going to be a much bigger issue because all those little glaze shards are going to stick to other stuff, other people's pots, the shelves. It's going to be a big deal, not just for yours, but for other people as well. So again, if you accidentally start glazing something that's not bisque fired, just put it on the bisque cart. Tell me it's not going to be a big deal. It's all going to work out, but you need to make sure that it's remedied. You also need to make sure your name is on it. If it is not yet on it, use red slip or black underglaze. Make sure it's thinned down some. Add just a little bit of water until it's nice and liquidy and brushable, and then put your name or initials on the bottom. Period is also nice, but name or initials are really important. Also, please make sure that it is yours. In the early times, when you first are starting to make things, especially on the wheels, they all kind of look alike. So if your name's not on it when you make it, it makes it so much harder to tell. And I can't necessarily tell which one is which. So you need to make sure you're putting your name on your pieces so that you are only claiming your pieces. Mistaken identity, happens. It's less likely to happen if you just take care and put your name on the bottom of things. All right, so why and when do I wax resist? First of all, why do you wax resist? You want to make sure that you've got certain areas protected so they don't end up having glaze on them. And while this prevents a lot of the glaze from going onto places, there may still be some, but it makes it easier to remove that glaze. So it really just makes that glaze easier to remove because sometimes you get glaze on in places and you didn't want it to happen. So when should it be applied? You need to, again, just like I've said before, you need to make sure it's bisque fired, and you also want to make sure your name is already on it, because otherwise, when you put your name on it after you wax resist, it'll just peel off. Where should it be applied? Generally speaking, on the foot, so wherever it's going to touch the shelf that I put it on in the kiln, and then also anywhere, if you've got a lid, anywhere that the lid and the pot touch each other. So on this slide, you'll see on here, this is the foot of this pot. So anywhere that pot is going to touch the shelf, and also I went up the pot just a little bit. You can't see it on this picture, but I went up just a little bit so that the glaze is less likely to run. Because on this pot, or on this glaze, I didn't know for sure whether it would run. On this pot, you see it's a lidded piece, and you can see right here, it was waxed there, but anywhere that the pot and the lid would touch, I've got, or I didn't actually make this one, but there was wax resist on the pot and on the lid where they would touch, because I can't make things hover in the kiln, so you've got to make sure that you don't have any glaze on places, that they're going to touch either the shelf or touch other pieces. When you're applying it, you're just using a paintbrush and you're applying one thin coat, just one thin coat. Make sure you don't get it on your hands, and then also when you're finished, you want to wash your brushes with soap and water. Now, I said don't get it on your hands. It's not going to hurt your hands. But if you get it on your hand and then touch your pot, you will leave waxy spots on your pots, and it'll resist where you don't want it to as much as it resists where you do want it to. Do not wash, or don't leave your wax to dry in your brush. It will ruin the brush most likely, or sometimes I can wash it out, but something that should have taken 20 seconds to wash out when the wax was wet can take 3 to 5 minutes to wash out and damage the brush once the wax sets. So please make sure you're taking care of supplies and tools by washing out those brushes. Or soap and water, and then put the brushes back, bristle end up, in the correct container. Always put the lid back on the wax and make sure that it's on securely. Otherwise, it can end up drying out too soon, and it makes it really difficult to work with. Put it back on as soon as you finish. Don't leave it off, because again, it dries up that wax and makes it harder to use. And make sure your hands are clean before you touch your pots. Don't put any lotion on or anything before you touch them, because that can act as a resist as well. If you get wax where you don't want it, just allow it to dry. Sand it off with sandpaper, not the green scrubby pads. That won't work. If you try and sand it off before it's completely dry, it just smears it around. Don't try and wash it off either. Once you've sanded it off, if you just moisten your finger or a sponge, dampen that area. If it goes dark, then the wax is gone. If it stays light, you still have some wax to remove. If you get a lot of wax where it doesn't belong, just re-bisque fire it, put it back on the shelf, maybe put a note in it so I know what's going on. Just re-bisque fire it, it's easier. Do not wax resist after you apply glaze. There's no reason after it's glaze fired, but don't put it on after you apply glaze either. There's just no point. It's like they say, lock on the barn door after the horse gets out. There's no point to it then. So to rinse your pot, you do need to rinse it. You want to rinse it the day you're going to glaze the inside. You just rinse the pot really quickly inside and out. Don't saturate it, just really quick rinse. Allow it to dry, just to absorb in. It'll look dry again, not shiny, before you start applying glaze. You don't need to dry it off. It absorbs in, it dries very quickly on its own. If you waxed first, make sure the wax is completely dry. If you are glazing the day you wax resist, rinse it first, then wax it, so that you're not having to wait for the wax to dry so you can rinse. Rinse first and then wax if it's the day that you actually apply. The reason that you rinse, it removes dust from the surface. It makes the glaze less likely to peel off or crack or crawl, which makes it look like water on a waxed car. It removes the amount of water that's absorbed by the clay body with the glaze. If it absorbs too much, it makes it too thick, and then it cracks as it dries. Choose your glaze. Write down your choices. Either write it down or take a picture of it with the pot and the page, or the pot and the containers of glaze, so that you can remember the good combinations and avoid those bad ones. And you can add it to the glaze presentation if they're good. If you are uncertain how to choose your glazes, go back, review the presentation on choosing your glazes on how help on how to choose. And that's the end. Yay!